Okay, everyone, welcome to this week's live session. I want to start off by saying that I have put some videos just recently into It's Learning. We had a video, a recorded live session I did that introduced this time period, 1200 to the present. I think we had another one on the between World War I and World War II. We had another one on the Cold War and decolonization. I think there are several that we have done along the way, and I combined them all and put them into one lesson. That doesn't mean you have to go back and listen to all of those, but I wanted you to have that in one place so you don't have to search back in the planner and the resources. They're all collected together, and it is everything that we've done so far, and those videos pretty much cover the required content that you need to know thus far. There is one more video there. It's called Globalization and the Rise of China, which we will talk about next week, but I went ahead and put it in there. The dates for that assignment line go all the way to next Friday. So it's not really an assignment. I just put them there so you would have access to them. So we are this week talking about two topics that are interwoven and connected to each other. And I gave a lot of details about this in a video that's in the resource I just shared. But the two big things after World War II are, first of all, decolonization. So all those massive colonies that were built during the Industrial Revolution, where industrial nations were trying to find resources and markets to sell into, those countries, those colonies all got their independence in this time period. So that scramble for Africa was just reversed. Britain seizing South Asia, that is its colony there in India, that will be reversed, and it will create India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So they have this incredible decolonization all over the world and independence movements. The other big event is the Cold War, and the Cold War is simply the non-direct struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union to reshape the world. So World War II was enormously destructive, and the world was being rebuilt. And the US wanted to rebuild the world in its image. The Soviet Union wanted to rebuild the world in its image. So we wanted to promote capitalist, democratic nations, and the Soviet Union wanted to bring nations into their sphere of influence of communist dictatorships. They wanted client states, as they said. The reason these two events are so intertwined is because as previously colonized areas gained their independence, the US and the Russians, the Soviet Union, were both competing to bring them into their sphere of influence or bring them into their camp. And thus the indirect struggle known as the Cold War. Now, it gets really complicated for the US. And by the way, the US used some important plans to fight the Cold War, you might say, such as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was the US promising to pay the bill to rebuild any country that was willing to receive that aid. So the US would write the check, so to speak, to these countries. There were strings attached. Those countries needed to be rebuilt in a specific way. So this is the method the US used. They needed to be rebuilt as trading partners with the United States. Remember that industrial nations need enormous amounts of resources, and they typically had colonized for those. They also needed markets to sell into. With the US being committed against imperialism, wanted to create nations not as colonies, but as free nations that would trade with the United States, and so the resources and the markets would go back and forth. They would mutually benefit each other. So when the US agreed to rebuild other nations, it wasn't completely altruistic. In other words, it wasn't a selfless act of pure, just sheer generosity. The US had its own self-interest in mind, but we thought it would also be good for the countries that we rebuilt. And I would point today to Japan and Germany, both of which the United States had a major role in rebuilding. And today they're trading partners with the United States, and it's almost impossible to conceive right now the US in a war against Japan or Germany. So that was the goal. So the Marshall Plan, the US would pay money. The strategy in the Cold War was not to go in and destroy communism, but it was to contain it, So that was called the policy of containment, to stop the spread of communism to any new area in the world. And so we were committed to side with whomever was struggling against communism. We didn't always live that out. In the country of Hungary, the people rose up and rebelled against the Soviet Union, and they were certain the U.S. would intervene. And it was largely a student movement that led into the general population. They were certain the U.S. would intervene and help free them from the encroachment of communism. But the Russians moved in with such an enormous amount of arms, of tanks, of armor, that for the U.S. to intervene would have been a direct, major confrontation with the Soviet Union. And so the U.S. did nothing. They did not heed the calls, these desperate pleas of these students radioing out to the U.S. You said you would help, and the U.S. did not help. And about 10,000 Hungarians died. So we didn't always follow through on that. But we did in Korea. When North Korea invaded the South, the U.S., going through the United Nations, would work to push the North back, or the communist soldiers back into the north part of Korea, which had been divided as a result of World War II into the North and South. Vietnam is an unusual case because the French colonized Southeast Asia, what they called Indochina, for its rice, for its rubber products, and really brutalized the population there. And when Japan in World War II took that from France, and Japan colonized the area. But then in 1945, Japan was defeated, the atom bombs had been dropped and they surrendered, and the Vietnamese celebrated they're finally independent. However, the French looked back to Vietnam and wanted to come back in and recolonize it. And the United States, at first, wanted Vietnam to be independent. But then the French told the U.S. that we cannot lose our empire. If you deny us the reestablishment of the French Empire, and that meant Vietnam, we might end up having to side with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So it was a little bit of blackmail. So what the U.S. did, the U.S. continued to support the French for years, and then when the French could no longer maintain its position in Vietnam and just pulled out, the U.S. rushed in, and the U.S. would fight what was its longest war in history until recently Afghanistan. The U.S. was there fighting for 20 years. So why were we fighting an independent nation that wanted its independence? It's because the leader of the independence movement, the most prominent leader of Vietnamese independence, was a communist. His name was Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh was a hero among a lot of the people. He stole from the French, and the Japanese were looting the rice harvest. Vietnamese people were starving to death. Ho Chi Minh would go and steal those supplies and give it back to the people. So he was somewhat of a hero, but he was a Marxist. He was a committed communist. And the U.S. was caught on the horns of a dilemma. We were for independence. We believed that that empires should be disintegrated and that people should have the right to self-determination. However, at the same time, what are we going to do if a nation wants independence but will be a communist nation? Then it flies in the face of the policy of containment. So the United States, scratching his head, is it worth it to give Vietnam independence if, in getting independence, Vietnam becomes a communist nation? The U.S. said no. They believed in this thing called the domino effect, that once one country fell, another one would fall, and another one would fall, and pretty soon all of Asia would be communist. In 1949, China became communist. And 1949 was a very tough year for the United States in the Cold War because the most populated nation in the world, China, became communist. Mao Zedong was successful, and they became communists. That same year, the Russians developed atom bomb technology. So the U.S. was no longer the only power in the world armed with atomic weapons. The Soviet Union now had atom bombs, and both nations raced to build the largest arsenals that they possibly could, thinking the other side would not attack us now, because it would mean mutually assured destruction. They shot their missiles at us, we would return, and none of us would survive. That was the mentality of the Cold War. So Vietnam is really a good, the struggle of the U.S. in Vietnam is really a good example of this intertwined interest between independence and communism. Now, there's another example that I want you to know, because in the College Board curriculum, you need to know that these independence movements were either negotiated and done peacefully, or they occurred through the process of pretty difficult and bloody armed insurrections. And so the case studies here would be India. India got its independence from Britain in a completely bloodless revolution. Britain granted them, negotiated independence with Gandhi. Now, India had problems after independence, but those were domestic issues between the religious factions that were left there. The Muslims were afraid that they'd be outnumbered, well, they were outnumbered by the Hindus, so they were afraid that a democracy would always have them marginalized. So there was conflict between Muslims and Hindus, and that led to the formation of Pakistan and India. So you have that going on there. Armed resurrections. Vietnam's example, but a great example is what happens in Algeria. Now, you have a podcast next week. The last podcast of the year talks about the independence movement in Algeria. And what you have there is a French settler colony, not like Vietnam, which was just an economic colony, but Algeria in North Africa was a settler colony. That means you have over 1 million French people who moved there and claimed it as their home. They are the ones who are most adamant about Algeria not getting independence, because they considered Algeria just another region of France. So that one will be a very bloody war, and that will be in the podcast next week. Now, the Cold War finally comes to an end when, and I have a video about this you'll see later, the Cold War comes to an end between 1989 and 1991, where the Soviet Union collapses, and it ushers in a period called globalization, where the halves of the world that could not communicate or trade with each other, the US sphere of influence and the Soviet sphere of influence, suddenly become integrated. And that happened at the same time that the internet was made public by the US Department of Defense. And so you have this incredible connectivity, unlike the world had never seen since the Columbian Exchange. And that will be the last topic that we'll talk about this year, is globalization. We'll also talk about the war on terror. So that brings us to the end of the kind of enrichment for this week, and give you a look of where we're going next week. So thanks.